Welcome to today's deep dive. And we are exploring a story that's both deeply embedded in history and also surprisingly relevant to today. We're turning to the book of Genesis, but we're not going to be in the well-trodden territory of creation.
Right.
Instead, we're focusing on Genesis chapter 38, a story that unfolds more like a family drama than a Sunday school lesson.
You're right. It's often overlooked, but it's a fascinating glimpse into the social structures of ancient Israel, particularly the dynamics of family inheritance, and then what happens when individuals kind of challenge those norms.
Yeah, let's start by meeting our main players. We have Judah, one of the patriarchs, those kind of crucial figures that are considered the fathers of the Israelite people.
Right.
It's in Judah's family line that things get well complicated.
Yeah, tragedy strikes early on with the death of Judah's sons, which leaves his daughter-in-law Tamar widowed not once but twice.
Oh, wow.
And this is where the ancient custom of levirate marriage comes into play.
Okay.
And it's key to understanding the story's unfolding.
For those unfamiliar, could you elaborate on levirate marriage and why it was so important back then?
Okay, so essentially, if a man died without an heir, his brother was obligated to marry the widow.
Okay.
The firstborn son from this union would then be considered the heir of the deceased.
Okay.
This ensured the continuation of his lineage and protected the widow's social standing.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This practice highlights just how intertwined lineage and social security were back then.
Yeah.
So with Judah's second son, Onan, next in line, you'd think he would fulfill this duty and marry Tamar.
That was the expectation. Yes, however, Onan, for reasons that the text implies, attempts to circumvent the responsibility of fathering an heir with Tamar.
Right.
This act, going against a deeply ingrained social and religious obligation, did not end well for him.
That's putting it mildly. But let's talk about Tamar's situation. She's been twice widowed, denied her chance at having children, and securing a future for herself. You have to imagine her feeling incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely. In that society, a woman's social standing, her very identity, was deeply intertwined with her role within a family.
Yep.
To be twice denied an heir placed her in a very precarious and uncertain position.
Yet Tamar is far from a passive victim in this story. Instead of accepting her fate, she takes a bold, even shocking action. She disguises herself as a prostitute.
And not just any prostitute. The text tells us she specifically positions herself where Judah, her father-in-law, is likely to encounter her.
Wow.
It's a calculated risk, a deliberate challenge to the very system that seems to be failing her.
It's a move straight out of a playwright's handbook.
Right.
Judah, completely unaware of her true identity, promises Tamar a goat from his flock in exchange for her services. But Tamar, ever the strategist, demands a pledge to make sure that he follows through. This is where those seemingly minor details in the biblical account become so critical. She requests his signet cord and staff, items that serve not only as forms of identification, but also symbols of his authority and position within society. It's like a high-stakes game of pawn, with Tamar holding on to these objects of power as her guarantee. What happens next? Well, let's just say Tamar's plan works perhaps a little too well, and she ends up pregnant.
News of Tamar's pregnancy eventually reaches Judah, and his reaction is immediate and fierce.
Yeah.
He's outraged by what he perceives as a grave moral transgression,
Right.
and calls for her punishment.
You can practically feel the tension building here. Tamar, facing condemnation, is in an incredibly precarious position, but as we've seen, she's not one to be underestimated.
Right. In a moment of brilliant countermaneuvering, Tamar reveals the items Judah had given her,
Yeah.
his signet cord and staff.
Wow.
It's a stunning revelation that completely flips the script.
It's hard to imagine Judah's reaction to be confronted so publicly with the evidence of his own actions. Must have been incredibly humbling, to say the least.
The text tells us that Judah acknowledges his wrongdoing. He realizes that he failed to fulfill his familial duty to Tamar by not ensuring she was provided for through levirate marriage. This public admission of guilt is significant, especially given his status within the community.
So what happens to Tamar? Is she condemned for her actions? Or is there another twist in this already complicated tale?
This is where the story takes an even more intriguing turn. While Tamar's actions were unconventional, to put it mildly,
Right.
the outcome of her pregnancy aligns with the very purpose of levirate marriage,
Okay.
to produce an heir for the deceased.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
So in a way, by becoming pregnant, she has, in the eyes of this society, fulfilled the obligation that was initially denied to her.
Precisely. It's not just about the act itself, but the social and familial context in which it occurs. Tamar's actions, though considered scandalous on the surface, ultimately served to uphold the very system that seemed to be failing her.
This adds a whole new layer of complexity to the story, doesn't it? It's no longer a clear-cut case of right and wrong, but rather an exploration of social dynamics, power, and individual agency.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that Tamar, despite the risks she takes and the societal constraints she faces, emerges from this situation in a position of, dare I say, vindication.
Vindicated? In what sense?
Think about it. She secured her own future and, more importantly, ensured the continuation of Judah's lineage by giving birth to twin sons, Perez and Zerah.
Okay.
And this is where the story takes on even greater significance, particularly for those familiar with the genealogy laid out in the Bible.
This is where it gets really interesting. I have a feeling you're about to connect this story to some major figures in biblical history.
You know me too well. Perez, one of the twins born from this tangled web of events, becomes a direct ancestor of King David, a pivotal figure in Israelite history.
That's incredible. You're saying this messy, scandalous family drama is woven into the very fabric of David's lineage? I never would have guessed.
And it doesn't end there. If you follow the genealogical line even further, you'll find that Perez, and by extension Tamar, is listed as an ancestor of Jesus himself.
Wow. It's almost impossible to grasp the ripple effect of this one story. Who could have predicted that such a complicated beginning would lead to such a significant lineage?
It really highlights how the writers of the Bible weren't afraid to grapple with difficult topics or shy away from stories that challenged conventional morality. In fact, these stories, often filled with twists and turns, continue to resonate with us today precisely because of their complexity.
Speaking of complexity, it makes you wonder, looking back at this story, who are we supposed to view as the good guys and the bad guys? It's not so clear-cut, is it? It really does make you think about it in a different way.
It does.
It challenges our assumptions, that's for sure. It's easy to fall into that trap of labeling characters as simply good or bad.
Right.
But this story really resists those easy categorizations.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so compelling, even thousands of years after it was written. It holds up a mirror to human nature with all of its complexities and contradictions.
Yeah, and let's not forget Tamar's agency in all of this. She's often viewed through the lens of scandal, but when you consider her situation, her actions, while daring, were also incredibly strategic.
Yeah, she was navigating a system that could have easily relegated her to the margins. But instead of being defined by circumstance, she took control, albeit in a way that challenged social conventions.
It makes you wonder if her actions, particularly her disguise in the encounter with Judah, might be interpreted as a form of protest against the very system that seemed to be failing her.
That's a fascinating interpretation, and one that scholars have debated for centuries. It's precisely this kind of ambiguity and openness to interpretation that makes these ancient texts so rich. They invite us to grapple with these timeless questions of justice and morality and the consequences of our actions.
Yeah, it's almost as if the story is less concerned with giving us definitive answers and more interested in prompting us to ask these difficult questions about power agency and how societies respond to those who dare to challenge the status quo.
You hit the nail on the head. The story of Judah and Tamar is not a simple morality tale. It's a complex tapestry of human emotions, societal pressures, and the often unforeseen consequences of our choices.
So as we leave this tangled web of a tale behind, what are some of the key takeaways that you're hoping our listeners will ponder? What makes this story resonate even today?
For me, it's the reminder that history, even ancient history, is rarely black and white.
Yeah.
It's filled with these nuanced characters like Tamar who challenge our expectations and force us to re-examine our own assumptions about right and wrong, justice and agency.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that the stories we tell and the ways in which we choose to interpret them have the power to shape our understanding of the world around us.
Precisely. And sometimes it's the stories that make us uncomfortable, the ones that defy easy answers, that have the most to teach us about ourselves and the societies we create.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What if the story of Judah and Tamar were told today? Would we judge these characters differently? Would we recognize the nuances of their actions and motivations? It's a question worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into one of the Bible's most fascinating and enduring narratives.